I actually I actually hadn't read the Sooner Safer Happier book, and I didn't know much about it. And I didn't tell you this, Dean, but as soon as I got off the call from you, I spoke to our technology director and said, "I'm doing this talk for Sooner Safer Happier," and he said, this is the book I keep telling you about. You've got to read this book." So I downloaded it when I was speaking to you, and I've read it, and funnily enough, I've just finished it actually, on the drive over to this office. And in terms of my background and what I've been doing for the past 10 years, there's a lot of, I really enjoyed the book and I loved it. And I think it's a great collection of some of the best tools and techniques. But where I'm from, I'll go into the background in a little bit, but you're very influenced by things like the Cynefin framework, by the Spotify model, not model, and thinking about how you apply that in different settings. So hopefully I'm going to share with you a few of our lessons. Let me just share my slide deck. Bear with me. Everyone see that okay? Great. Okay, good. So if I just bear with me, my slides are just going very slow at the moment, but I've got it. Okay. Yeah, so how I'm going to do this. I've been working in the innovation space for 10 years. I'll go back to the beginning in a minute, and I'll explain the organization I work from. What I'm probably going to do is to go through sort of 5 lessons, pause for a minute, and then allow any questions. If there's no questions, I'll just move on. But I'm also happy for you to ask any questions in the chat, and Dean and Co, just jump in if you need to. So we, as an organization, are a housing association. That would be probably known in the same way in the States as a non-profit housing association. And we are the very definition of a legacy organization in that we were formed in 1963. So we're not only pre-modern internet, we're pre-colour televisions being in everybody's homes in the UK. So we've got a lot of legacy and a lot of baggage. That's just as by way of background, and we are quite a large housing association. We're in merger talks at the moment with another housing association that, if that was to go ahead, would make us one of the biggest in the UK. In case you don't know, the housing market in the UK is dysfunctional. It is very difficult for people to access affordable housing, even if you're on a very good income now. Housing associations were created in the 1960s as a response to supplying a solution for the people who the market doesn't work. And that customer segment has grown massively. So it was traditionally people on very, very low incomes. It's not just that anymore. It can be people on much higher incomes as well. That's what we do. And we provide a range of homes to do that. This won't mean much to people from the States, but essentially in terms of how we operate, with the central England bit, essentially, the Midlands where I'm from, down to the Cotswolds and to Bristol and South Gloucestershire. As someone's commented on Sabina, it's pretty much a Western world problem now in terms of the lack of access to affordable housing. So this is the only slide I'm going to talk about housing before I move on to practical lessons for you. In terms of where we are on the journey we've been on, I'll start from the beginning and where we are at the moment. We've just recently launched a new strategy. We're trying to now think much longer term about what we do, because housing by its very nature doesn't go away. We're going to be in those communities and in those places for decades to come. Therefore, we've got a long-term objective in terms of how we interact and how we create better solutions for our customers and our stakeholders. You'll see on one of the 8 strategic objectives is agile working to solve problems is now part of our strategy. We have worked in an agile way for some time, but that hasn't been organizational wide, and that's something that the new strategy will build. You'll also see as well the guiding principles of the strategy are pretty much design principles, really. And part of the journey we've been on is going from where we started, which having a small innovation lab with its own design principles, to embedding design thinking into the actual strategy itself. And I'll talk about that journey as well. Bear with me, I've just moved the message chat over the temporary button. Okay, so The problem that we was to face, if I go back 10 years ago, we're a successful organization, but I've said with a lot of legacy business model. Okay, so we're a pre-digital organization. And the exam question, if you like, that I was asked to help solve was how should an organization like ours move to acting in a more agile way? How could it move to thinking more like a startup? Well, basically, an organization like ours can't think like a startup because Steve Blank makes a really good distinction. A startup is in search of a business model, a scalable business model. A company is a permanent organization designed to execute. So it can't act the same way. What it can do is to look at some of the behaviors of startups and to think about how it can introduce those into the organization. And obviously that's the point that the book makes, that actually you can start bringing in some of those techniques in any organization or even any scenario. And I'm going to give you some examples of what we've done. I will just say very quickly, I don't pretend we have finished that journey. As the book makes clear, the journey never ends, and it's a continual approach of refining and reinventing. And I would say over 10 years of our innovation approach, I probably draw it into roughly 5 phases and 5 reinventions that we've done within that 10-year period, some more significant than others. So I was asked by the executive to go away and think about how you could bring some of these techniques into an organization like ours that could be a little bit more risk averse because it's quasi public sector, it's non-profit, and it can have a perception of over-regulation. So I was given a free pass basically and got myself into the usual subjects, your Google suspects even rather than subjects, your Googles, your Amazons, your Apples, and I managed with a colleague of mine to get through the door to see how they were working. But we visited a lot of innovative not-profits as well and smaller, more community-based organisations to see how they were approaching, I'll use the term innovation, but agile techniques. And the thing that I took away from them was that nobody was perfect. I think that's a really important thing to remember wherever we all are on a journey. Nobody's got it absolutely sorted. So I didn't see perfection anywhere, but I did see some common patterns that actually produced really good results. The things I picked up was, regular intense debates between teams, not being afraid of diversity of opinion and diversity of thought and diversity full stop. That's the first thing. High standards, really committed people. Sounds obvious, but it's one that I picked out. The one that I don't think we had at the time was a permission to be different and a culture where it's not just allowable to push back, but it's encouraged to push back from anybody in the organization, pushing back to the CEO. And that was something I saw as a common pattern. Now, the book makes clear the importance of acting experimentally. That was a skill we didn't have at the time, I didn't think, and that was something we had to develop. The final thing I saw was that the best organizations were in this stuff for the long term. They weren't just doing it as a one-off, let's do an agile program, let's have an innovation lab. They were thinking about it as a long-term thing. And, I remember I visited Ricoh, a Japanese company, and they said this thing to me about their approach. They said, oh, it's not perfect yet. We've only been doing it 50 years. That's what they said. We've only been doing this 50 years. And I reflected on that on my own organization at the time. Well, it's difficult to keep something going in the same way for 6 to 12 months, never mind 50 years. That thinking long term and thinking about all of those things, not just as a one-off big bang, but thinking about them from a cultural point of view is something I took away. So we came away, we started really small. We assembled a team of 4 colleagues to work as what we call Bromford Lab, which was enabled as a team to help other people think in more agile ways and to be comfortable with failure. The pitch at the time was that 70% of what we worked on would fail, and to create that understanding at the top that we would help the organization solve problems in a different way. We didn't reach the 70% failure rate, but we wanted to create it allowable, that was seen to be a learning, to be seen as learning rather than failure. I do still use the word failure though, because I think it's important for colleagues to understand that not everything's meant to work. Some things are meant to fail because there are a number of factors, and I'll touch upon that maybe a little later. So I'm going to go through 10 lessons I've picked up over the past 10 years. The first thing is like, think about some things, but don't overthink things. The best learning in many occasions is just to get started and to start doing something. And I always think back to, I think if you observe kids and how they learn to, to ride a bike or even learn to walk, the best learning is done by getting something started and seeing what happens next, and to creating it in a way that is de-risked and safe to fail. And by way of example of that, when we said these are the 10 things we think we're going to work on, okay, and we agreed that with the exec and we worked up some proposals, do you know how many things of those 10 things we ever worked on? One of them. The other 9 fell by the wayside. Only one thing was worked on, because once we started getting in the groove of doing things and trying things out, people came up with other ideas or other problems that they thought were more valuable or more important. And my kind of tip here is, I'm sure you know this, but I think it's one thing that we don't talk about enough. We made everything that we were working on really accessible, really visible. We don't do this anymore. We are going to bring it back, though. This pipeline here, which is our visible exploration pipeline, was accessible outside the organization as well. So anybody who worked in the same sector, even a potential competitor, although we're not really a competitive environment, could see what we were working on. And we did that because we wanted to engage the ability for colleagues to challenge other people's ideas or other people's problems. And what happened naturally is a lot of those problems fused into one thing, or actually one big problem was taken away and divided into some smaller component parts. But it was a really important way of starting to prioritize what we worked upon. Again, another really obvious thing is that often in big organizations, we spend more time talking to ourselves rather than talking to actual users. And one of the things we absolutely, have picked up is the ability to move from talking internally about something to starting the conversation with people who live in our homes, who live in our communities. That's something that we've very much focused. We're still not there yet, but the biggest project I'm working on at the moment that I would say is the biggest strategic shift we've ever made. We unveiled that we started talking about that with users, with customers, before we took that to the board, to the CEO even. We started that conversation with them. And I think that's really important, because that's where you'll get the best learning. And however you think of developing solutions, a lot of those early prototypes can fail as soon as they meet the real world. And the photo here is an example of something we worked at with Co-op Digital. And Co-op Digital had got this idea about having a really affordable light bulbs and things to electrical items. And they've got a particular proposal that would enable people to basically go into a rental scheme and they'd get them free of charge as they actually use them, kind of a subscription scheme. And we went out with them to do, I just said, the best thing to do, let's just knock some doors, let's get some user feedback on your prototype, mock it up, get it out there. And it died almost straight away in its first incarnation, because what we found is people on the lowest income who you think would want to save money, the idea of another subscription didn't give them the immediacy of any savings. So straight away, the issue became the product might work, but the subscription model doesn't work. So from that, we can get early learning, we can pivot, we can change that. And they went away and rethought that problem. But that was literally doorstep research conducted within an afternoon that completely changed the nature of their product development. The next lesson is that business plans are great, but the way, and the book makes this clear, the best way you can build a movement behind an idea or a problem is that it's got a groundswell of opinion. And sometimes that can be literally 3 or 4 people. It doesn't need to be a lot of people, but the more people who start engaging, the better earlier. So if I give you an example of something that we worked on, which is what we call our neighborhood coaching approach, that came about because we wanted to reimagine the relationship we had between us as a housing association and the people who lived in our homes. That's often a kind of top-down transactional relationship. We wanted to start reimagining that. And when that movement started, it was probably, I mean, I was in the room when the conversation started, and it was me and three other people. They really, at that time, couldn't even define the problem that they had got, but there was a feeling of moving away to create a different relationship. And that's something that we worked out with them and then got more people involved. And the first thing we did to start moving on that relationship, we literally recruited. When I say recruited, we asked people, can you give us 2 weeks to spare of your time? And we took two people who were up for it. Again, they were probably people who were ahead of the change curve. They were people who wanted to change the way they worked. We took them and said, we're going to change the way you do the role. The first thing we want you to do is to go out and have conversations with people and not make use of any of our current technology. And they went out and they were a bit scared at first, but they found it completely different and exciting to go out with a blank sheet of paper and start talking to our customers about the relationship that they might want that we don't currently have at the moment. As I say, that was a 2-week test, time boxed. We had video diaries done on a daily basis. We've now got 250 full-time neighbourhood coaches across the organisation. So that's something that's completely changed the way we do things. The old approach would be the relationship was one manager to about 600 customers. The relationship now is 1 to about 175 to 200. So we've really focused that relationship and gone actually in the opposite direction to a lot of our competitors who are moving to digital only services. And we felt that moving to a more person-based service was the right thing for us at that time. And it certainly did help when we went into the pandemic. Our business was much better focused to deal with problems than many of our other colleagues in other organisations. I'll skip over that. The next thing I want to say, and this is for people who don't have loads of money, is to think about that having no budget or low budget, I honestly believe can be an advantage. And it's one of the things that we've been keen to do when we started up. We had 4 colleagues and we had about £40,000 to start tests to get some things running. And we didn't want a lot of money because we said, actually, by having less money, we can really think about how we are much more creative. And it's something that I'm working with some teams at the moment, and they're saying we need some more budget to do some of this stuff. And I actually don't think they do at this stage. I think they can think about using constraint as a positive. These films are dating me. I probably could have thought of some more current examples. But if you think about something like Jaws, it was Steven Spielberg's first mainstream film. He spent most of the budget on a shark that subsequently fell apart as they started filming. So they're having to create a monster movie without a monster because they couldn't afford another copy of the shark. And I'm sure most of you have seen Jaws, but he innovated completely by usually showing the shark just at surface level. They introduced music to signal fear. They moved objects at surface level to build tension. That didn't happen and wouldn't have happened if he would have had the huge budget. He used constraints to actually force creativity. And I think it's an important lesson I've picked up over the past 10 years. The other thing is about, the one challenge I had to the book is that I think we can overuse jargon. People like us, I'm talking about, people who work in the change space. And I think it can switch people off sometimes. Now, and I know that was acceptable in the use of the book because we're talking to people like us. But when we go outside of this community into the real world, I think it's really important to make this as accessible as possible. And creativity ultimately should be about having fun. It can be working hard and solving problems, but there can be a fun element to it as well. So we've kind of learned to, not dumb things down, but present the difference between tests and pilots in a fun way. We've tried not to force techniques onto people, but to make people feel that the technique is something that would give them better value or be more comfortable for them, essentially. And we've learned a lot of lessons particularly in the early days of introducing agile and introducing things like squads, where the organization pushed back against some of those things. So we try to keep it real as we can with language and make it as humanistic as possible. And when I say about fun, okay, this was an example, and I want to mention it because we were doing some work around um, decreasing loneliness, which is obviously a serious problem, particularly amongst people who live on their own, but not just live on their own. And one of some residents in an older person scheme, they saw the thing, you know, they do in the States, you'll know about this Thanksgiving turkey thing where they give it a pardon at the beginning of Thanksgiving. They'd seen that and they wanted to do a similar thing in the run up to Christmas in the UK, where we usually have turkey. They didn't want to eat the turkeys. They wanted to get the turkeys together and look after them because there was one going free locally. And they wanted to trial it. Would this create a talking point amongst the older people in the community? And now, obviously, we've got things like you can't have pets in some of our communities for whatever reason. But we challenged that and we were able to run a test. The turkeys created a huge talking point, as you can imagine. I've forgotten their names now. And I did have a photo of them, but I had to create that image earlier with artificial intelligence. So they're not the actual turkeys. They are AI turkeys. But I use that as an example of it. It was a small test. It was a fun test, actually, but it actually was there to solve a serious problem, but we solved it in a creative way. And I think all of these techniques that are in the book can absolutely be applied to software problems, but they can equally applied to very human problems like loneliness, like fuel poverty, like social isolation. All of these techniques can be applied in different scenarios. The next thing is really about thinking about technology. And I know you all know this, but often organizations don't know this. They come with technology as a solution rather than as an enabler. And something we've worked at a lot is to get people to think about, you know, the actual problem and not rush to technology for solutions. You know, I'm a big fan of the work of Hans Monderman, who was a Dutch traffic engineer. And his kind of take was, you know, completely in the opposite direction of most traffic engineers. He looked at all the things that traffic engineers do, which was to provide more technology, more road signs, more flashing lights, more speeding signs. And his contention was it wasn't a technology problem, it was a behavior problem. Therefore, what we'll actually do, and that's been rolled out across Europe and I'm sure parts of the States as well, is, you know, rather than put more road signs, we'll take some out. And he found that shared spaces, not in every context, it wouldn't be no good on a motorway or anything, but in some places, actually the removal of technology actually made people cooperate more. And it's something I'm always trying to remind people of, is don't rush to technology for solutions. Give you an example of that. I think this was a good recent example where our customer services teams, who don't genuinely have the same job flexibility as the rest of us in the organization because they have to answer phones, they have to answer social media, they have to have a rota system. They came to us with a request, an idea to actually introduce a piece of technology that enabled them to choose different shift patterns and to collaborate around sharing their different shift patterns to give them more flexibility. The rule we gave to them as part of the test is you can do what you want as long as it doesn't disrupt customers. But the one thing you can't do is use any technology. You've got to create a paper-based solution. And what they came up with through the paper-based solution was far more innovative than what they would have had if they just purchased a piece of technology, because forcing them into a paper-based routine with a lack of technology really made them think creatively, like those constraints I was talking about earlier. So first take for us is always don't go to technology. Now, I know you know about silver bullet solutions because refers to them, but we find that organizations will often go into what seems to be the simplest and biggest solution to something rather than explore different options. I mean, the world we work in, most of the problems are wicked problems, which I'm sure you know are problems that are either unsolvable or interconnected, or, you know, they're difficult to fix and sometimes even impossible to fix. The previous question was about homelessness. If it was an easy problem to fix, we'd have fixed it ages ago. So these are wicked problems that manifest themselves very differently in complex environments. And organizations will often go into one-shot solutions into that, which I know, you know, the techniques within the book and the techniques that you carry out resist against that. But that's something we have to constantly remind colleagues is that these things, if they were easy to solve, someone would have solved them. And we need to think about some things more rather than look for silver bullets. A good example for us that affects well, affects the whole world, obviously, but affects our industry particularly badly, is around climate change and net zero. So when we started thinking about that, we did use some agile techniques, but we took a full year to think about the problem. That was deliberate. We didn't want to rush into things, and that was to allow us to deeply think about the problem and then move into a creative role and a creative capacity within that. And this is the most exciting chart, but it's interesting because when colleagues said we want you to do something about climate change, what they were talking, what they were suggesting was, let's give up our plastic coffee cups. Let's do something about our business mileage. But if you can see by the chart on the left, for Bromford, our CO2 outputs emissions from maintenance and business mileage is microscopic compared to our homes. That's the big problem, and that's what we need to change, is in terms of some of the age of our homes and the emissions they create. So by taking time to think about something, you can think about actually what's the actual source of the problem and how can you be more creative around that, rather than rushing into silver bullet activity. This meme will be totally lost to anybody outside the UK and of a certain age. But where we've moved to, and where I think we're in a much more comfortable place now, is that, as I say, there isn't a one-size-fits-all to change or innovation or agile. But I think ultimately the best place it can be embedded is within the strategy. And that's where we've got to at the moment. So when I was asked to kind of write the strategy last year, what I thought is, let's embed some agile techniques within the strategy itself. Let's build the strategy as an agile innovation strategy. And that's what essentially we've done. So in terms of this is a slide from the strategy, the first year 1 and 2 is a period of discovery, trial, mobilize, embed, and it's not until year 4 we go to the embedding phase. And obviously in year 4, we're moving on to the creation of the next strategy. That is something I wish I'd realized 10 years ago. Okay. It's the one thing that I wish I'd realized, because the change process and people's appetite for it has become far greater, because it's not seen as something that's different from work. It's seen as the part of the organizational work itself. And that's been really a lesson learned for me. Now, obviously, I wouldn't have been able to achieve that 10 years ago, but I would have moved to that a lot more quickly than I probably would have done. That I probably would have did. The other lesson, as I kind of wrap up this bit, is it's really important that not just people who are working within agile teams, but the people surrounding them are really curious, and curiosity is something that doesn't just happen. I mentioned it earlier, we're very curious as children, but a lot of the modern workplace can take that curiosity out of you, particularly if you're working in kind of legacy organizations. And it's something that constantly needs developing. So there's some great, obviously, techniques within the book and some examples of, what can engage people. I just say to people, just be creative, keep being creative, try new things. It doesn't matter if they don't work, but try and think about how you're building colleagues' curiosity. So for us, we've assembled a kind of community around that whole curiosity as a community. This is a slide from one of our internal sites that we call Ideas at Bromford. It's all about generating ideas and new practice about ways of working, our homes, our customers and places, our world, and drawing in some of those early adopters. And that's what we've built this as, essentially, is almost like a kind of a little containment pen for the people who are frustrated with their current ways of working and want to do things differently. And what we found is you get all sorts of colleagues who are not the usual suspects, and they're people you don't know, and they've got kind of ideas, inspiration, or they're interested in things that aren't currently on the organizational roadmap. So that's been successful for us. I think it's my final thing to say, actually, is we talk about collaboration a lot, but sometimes we don't need to collaborate. There's certain problems that benefit themselves in terms of some really deep lone thinking. The net zero stuff was a good example, but we need to do a lot of research and to think about, let's understand what this actually means to us rather than just think about doing activities. So learning when not to collaborate, when to collaborate, or when to bring people back together at the right point, I think is really important as well. The bit that I was kind of stay on that is that ultimately problems best get solved when they're given to a small, semi-autonomous, localized team. This is something we're working on at the moment because we're making a shift to place-based working, where we're bringing teams who've literally had hardly anything to do with each other, taking them away from their existing management and providing it to a new place-based team. This one's going to launch at the beginning of August. And as you can see from the top, we're using agile techniques in scenarios where people are caretakers and cleaners and people who landscapers and cut the gardens. And we're actually going to be introducing agile techniques to them. And then we're going to train them. We've got 3 workshops planned over the next few weeks where we're going to train them in agile techniques and allow them to define their ways of working themselves. So I think what's really good about the tools that within the book is they can be applied to almost any scenario. You just need to be lighter in some cases than bringing the full agile package. And ultimately, to kind of sum up, what I've learned over the past 10 years is it is about the right solution for the right people at the right time, and it isn't about ideas. And the other thing I've learned is that sometimes things aren't meant to happen, and you can keep trying and trying and trying, and it just isn't happening. And something can happen. I've got an example where we tried to push something that seemingly everybody was behind. It was going nowhere. We had 2 new people in the organization. They rebooted it and it flew. And I don't know what it was about it. I can't even identify it scientifically what was different. But 2 people created the change that previously wasn't there. So some things, it really is quite random at times. And I think that's why it's good to have that visible pipeline, because you can look at the things that haven't failed, that haven't worked, and bring them back and try another time. That's where I'll stop. Thank you.
Paul, thank you so much. That was amazing. I love the animations and the injection of some humor and some maybe quite esoteric cultural references that may not have landed with everyone, but there was something there for everybody. Thank you so much. I would like to invite people on the call to pose a thought, pose a question, share what's in their mind. It may be just thoughts which aren't fully formed. This is a supportive and safe environment. So if you want to share anything, feel free to unmute yourself or drop a thought into the chat.
Oh, thanks, Dean. Thanks, Paul. Fantastic talk. I'll just chip in now with a thought which follows on from your sort of closing thoughts. And yeah, I'm just thinking about the need for the right conditions to be in place for changes to be able to land and innovations, and just how complex and tricky that can be, just as illustrated by what you were saying there. And yeah, not often easy to put your finger on, and you can do some thinking around conditions for change, but in the event, yeah, you won't necessarily get it right, I think is my thinking. You can do all the things you think might help, but actually, yeah, it may not happen.
Absolutely. I mean, there was one period that, there was a 3-year lost period that I haven't really referred to within that 10-year period, where we went through 2 mergers as an organization. And the mergers took so much bandwidth out of the organization, first of all, the capacity, because it's going through a very fundamental, almost visceral change, a change that affects people's jobs, affects people's job titles, affects their employment. Introducing change alongside that it's too much, essentially, for some people. So as you say, sometimes we have to roll with the conditions.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
So Paul, thanks very much. I like what you say a lot. Practical man. There's one thing I didn't hear, and it happens to be my specialty, so I want to hear it one way or the other. You didn't explicitly mention setting objectives for your projects and sub-projects. And I'm very interested in setting quality objectives, not just functional objectives. What can you tell me?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good point, and I think it's about, you're right, quality objectives, but also objectives that lead to the right outcomes as well. And as you know, we've been careful. So if I go to the latest version of the strategy, we've been really clear to say, this is what the outcome needs to be ultimately, or this is the place we want to be, but we're not going to be too specific about doing that. The project I mentioned at the end that we're just trying to, we are launching, that's been a really interesting one by way of that example about the kind of quality objectives, because it's been clear that the management has been trying to set those objectives. And we're talking about working in a localized, place-based way where it is the team and the local community who need to set some of those quality objectives, because they can help define the quality, and from that we can identify the value. And I've had to work almost as a bit of a buffer, to be quite honest, to say, just hold on, let's assemble this team, because they're not even properly assembled yet. Let's get them together to talk about, what they want, but also what do our users want out of that, and how can we develop quality objectives out of that. So I'm totally with you. It is really important, and I think the more localized those objectives become, the better quality. I don't want to use specific examples from our industry, but sometimes we talk about things like first time fix and getting it right first time for customers. When we speak to our customers, they're not as bothered about it being right first time. They're bothered about getting a quality solution that doesn't break down again. So the customer value is, I don't want this to break down again. Our kind of objective can often be, let's just hit it quickly, get it done, and move on to the next one. So I'm totally with you, but I think in the kind of agile environment, we need to make those as localized as possible.
Good point. And now what I'll do is, with your permission, I will put a little something in the chat that everybody can share about quality objectives, a freebie, and I'll send a little bit more to you by email. And we
Please
can
do
chat
that.
about it. I can help you, and I'd like to help you for free. Okay.
Thank you, Tom. Sabina, you've put something in the chat. Do you still have the ability to unmute yourself? Because if you do, you're welcome to vocalize your thoughts or question.
Yes, thank you for that. The question I put in here is if you've got any strategies for working with your volunteers and your participants that you really don't have stick to make them do what you ask them to do. And because this is something that I'm working on here as a project, implementing a mentorship program for IT newcomers to the province, and getting them to log into a system, getting them to complete a particular assessment, getting them to engage, getting them, it's like it's not working. It's kind of working unless I'm totally hand-holding the whole process. And I'm just curious, in your kind of environment where you've got all these different kinds of parties that you're having to deal with, how do you keep them engaged, involved, and accountable to their participation commitment?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, and I wish I had a silver bullet answer to you to say do that. Unfortunately, I don't. What I would probably say is that I think the thing I've learned is, what are the scenarios where you need to have an element of tight, I'll use the word control, but a tight overview, and what are the areas where you can afford people to go off and develop their own things. So what we've tried to do is to develop a framework. I might be able to share something with you actually by way of example that actually says, what are the areas where we can give people a toolkit where we actually need to just, they can do this themselves. As long as we've got a problem, here's some simple techniques that they can do. The example I gave with the contact team, that was very, very light touch. It was literally us running a session for them, checking in with them 4 weeks later, providing support if they needed, as opposed to the areas where we absolutely need commitment on this. So in the example we're moving to at the moment, there will be tightly controlled pilots. They'll have control groups. They need to have that commitment. And with that one, we're absolutely saying, you know, we need to change your management and to build you as a team, and we need to have 100% cooperation within this. You know, it's a difficult one. You know, ideally, you'd have people who are volunteering for that stuff and they want to do it, but that is hard to achieve sometimes. The project I'm doing at the moment, you know, 50% have volunteered, 50% have been voluntold. Essentially, that's not ideal. I'd like 100% volunteers, but that isn't always there. The only other thing I'd say probably on that is that little and often is better than actually trying to force your techniques on people. One of the things that I kind of did pick up, the book reminded me of it, is in the early days, I think we were more worried about the purity of our technique and methodology than the actual engagement and outcomes we needed. And we put our foot on the gas a little bit too hard in terms of how we took people through it. I think we've learned now to identify things where we can afford a very, very loose approach. It doesn't matter if it's not 100% agile capital A, but it does the job for that circumstance. But there are areas where we do need to have a tightly controlled approach.
Yeah, it's being flexible. You've made reference to the book. What is the book? And I believe, Tom, you've added some things here too. Thank you for that share. But I'm not sure, Paul, what book you're referring to.
Dean can give you an overview of that. He's the expert.
And in fact, Anne's about to bring into camera. It's the book behind this community, this movement, Sooner Safer Happier, which came out around 5 years ago. Perhaps someone can correct me. Around that time,
mid 2020, I think.
It's
a lockdown book, yeah, I believe.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for sharing that. Didn't have a clue.
The publisher is actually running a summer sale for it right now. So IT Rev.
Where could I go to find that?
I think Amazon in the US. In fact, if you Google,
I'll check Amazon Canada. Good.
Oh, Canada, yeah, there should be a Canada.
Yeah, good. Thank you.
I got the audio book. Did it in 2 weeks. There you go.
Thank you very much.
Good stuff.
I love the examples I love the examples and snippets you put there, Paul. Particularly love the constraints, force, creativity, Jaws example you gave.
Yeah, well, I think that's the thing, isn't it? About, you know, almost everybody who comes to me will say, you know, we need more money for this, and usually, actually, they don't. Actually, there are some things when we get to the design stage. Obviously, if you're thinking about technology and technological solutions, of course, there's a budget implication, but a lot of things can be explored by giving people time to do those things, and the kind of increasing the bandwidth on that, which is another difficult thing to do. But that's a story for another day, isn't it?
Paul, I liked your example of trying to find a viable solution, which is first of all paper-based. I often share the thought experiment with my colleagues. Can this problem be solved without touching or creating one line of code? So people actually get off their seats and go and speak to an upstream or downstream team, just see if we can solve this problem or find a solution human to human. And if we can, then consider judiciously and cautiously, can we get some technology to prop up something which is going to be successful in a repeatable, scalable fashion? And the example that came to my mind is that I once worked for a grocery retailer in the UK, and in their small local convenience stores, we knew that we weren't having the right SKUs in their fresh baked goods section. And what this large corporation would normally do is run the numbers, do analysis, and it will take a few weeks and we'll come back with some kind of recommendations. But what this store manager did with permission was actually close the in-store bakery and learn over a couple of mornings what customers wanted through the complaints they made. So where's my baguette? Where's my pan of raisin? And from that, it was a limited experiment in one store. We learned quite rapidly and cheaply what customers are seeking, and formative and impactful and in situ than doing some kind of analysis over numbers, which would take us. I love your example of doing paper-based. What can we do without any technology?
Well, if you think of those things, and I think again it's referenced in the book that we keep referencing, but if you think of all the learning that happened during the pandemic, in the early days of the pandemic, when communities literally had to cooperate with each other and to get supplies to neighbours and things like that. And there was a heavy technology aspect to that, but equally we had an issue where we had not long after the pandemic, we had a data breach, an attempted cyber attack, and we had to shut down most of our technology. Some of our restarting it, some of it took up to 5 months to get it back online, essentially. And curiously, Dean, we found that some teams worked better without the technology that they've been doing to their jobs. Now, obviously, that means the technology wasn't sufficient, wasn't good enough. But it's interesting the learning you can get, as I say, with no technology. And certainly when we started the redevelopment of the neighbourhood coach role, that was done, as I said, with no technology initially, because what we didn't want to do is to get people to follow a process. We wanted to allow them to actually create their own process and to create the outcomes that they needed to deliver. So yeah, I think it's we all do it, don't we? We all rush to technology for solutions. It's part of what we do, and we've almost forgotten how some aspects of our lives were living before technology. And it's useful to remind ourselves now and again that there are other ways of getting solutions.
Awesome. Thank you, Paul. Any other thoughts or questions you'd like to pose, Paul? Okay. Well, Paul, thank you so much. Where can people find you and learn more about your work and thought leadership?
Yeah, they can find us on Bromford Lab, which is www.bromfordlab.com. My website is paulitaylor.com. I'm on X, I'm on LinkedIn. You'll find me. Paul Taylor's a pretty common name, but if you put Paul Taylor Bromford, you'll find me. Yeah, and message me. I'm quite happy to talk about this on a one-to-one basis, and share things. Going back to the community you're creating, that's the biggest thing. One thing I haven't mentioned, the importance of community, the importance of sharing and sharing progress and sharing things that haven't worked is massively important. So I'm more than happy to continue the conversation elsewhere.
Thank you so much, Paul. And Kate, any final things we ought to do before we wrap up?
Nothing from me.
I'm just thinking we could just mention that we do have a Sensei for Happier Slack community. If anybody's not aware of that, you might want to have a look that up. You can get details of that from the Sensei for Happier website.
That's great. Thanks, Anne. Well, unless there's anything else, once again, thank you so much, Paul. This is recorded, so we're going to post the recording on the YouTube channel. And we'll see you at the next meetup. So it's not going to be next month because it's a summer break. We're going to announce one for September, the month of September. Thanks so much, everyone. All the best.
Thank you. Thank you, Dean. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you.